All right, welcome back. This is the first of the presentations on the Black Death in Europe. It will include here a basic narrative and overview of the arrival of the plague and its presentation in Europe socially, historically. Let's begin with the issue just of effects. By the population in 1400 in Europe is going to be about half of what it was in 1300. So this is after a 400-year period of population growth that had laid the foundations for the modern world, and the Western world was within a few years halved. Plague would come back pretty regularly on an 11-year cycle and wreak havoc repeatedly, although it should be said with ever lowering death rates. The population of Europe would not begin to recover for well over a century, and you can see this pretty well marked out here. Let's see, let me get the... If you have, obviously this is the mark of the arrival of the Black Death, and you're not going to get a recovery for well over a century, so right into the 16th century. And it wasn't, in fact, until the 17th century that in England population levels regained where it had been before the Black Death. So you can see the mark here is well into the middle of the 17th century. Another way of looking at this is the population chart, and if you look across the Indian subcontinent and then Europe, you can see that over here you get a massive drop off of the European population accounts. These population decreases kept going for several centuries and persisted in cycles until the plague disappeared in the 1830s. Its effects were widespread, systematic, and utterly paradigmatical. It's thus one of the singular events in world history. So we're going to deal with the actual disease in the next segment, but plague, should be said, is highly virulent, which means that it spreads incredibly quickly, right? The chance of infection is incredibly high. And that after infection, if you get it, it kills more than 50% of the people that it infected. So the plague seems to have begun, or seems to have jumped from its zoological foundation in the earth and rats and rodents to the human population sometime in the 1330s, somewhere in Central Asia. The disease probably originated in a reservoir of wild rodents. The best guess is the marmot, the tarbagan marmot, in the Asiatic steppe, probably in western Kyrgyzstan. Some people think it was maybe farther east, but somewhere in this area. As far as is known, the first evidence for human mortality from the plague, the first evidence of it, dates from 1338 and 39. So there was a medieval cemetery that was that archaeologists studied in the town, this is in Kyrgyzstan, in a town called Issyk-Kul, which is right on that sea right there, where archaeologists noted a series of an extra heavy series of mortalities in 1338 and 1339. And there's a series of gravestones that identified the cause of death as plague, and that seems to be the earliest evidence of human death that we have today. From Central Asia, the plague spread south to China and to India, west through Transoxiana and into Persia. It probably reached southern Russia by 1345 or 1346. It was in Crimea by 46 and on the Black Sea. So here is the Black Sea that we're going to come back to. It was aided in this by the ancient Silk Road and its associated networks of caravan routes. Bruce Campbell, who's a historian, wrote a magnificent book called The Great Transition, Climate, Disease, and Society in the Late Medieval World, where he's really trying to unpack what was the causes and what was the interchange between climate and society and disease. And he had a phrase that really struck with me. He said, over the next 7 years, this is from 1346 onwards, he says, over the next 7 years, it, that is plague, it assumed the guise of a highly contagious pandemic and spread with devastating effects throughout Asia Minor and the Middle East, North Africa, and the whole of Europe, as far west as and north as Ireland and Norway. And I want to just dwell a minute on this idea of it assumed the guise of a highly contagious pandemic. And I like this idea of the guise of human contagion because if it is not, the science will tell us that in fact bubonic plague cannot be passed from human to human, but that is not what it felt like, and to all intelligent observation, it seemed in fact that humans were relaying the disease onto one another. So the disease reached the West in 1347. You might want to take a minute, you can pause me and take a look at this map. You can see the stages of the spread. You can follow the arrows, but more important is the color zones that show how it's moving onwards, and it gives a good sense of both the rapidity and just the magnitude of the area that it covered. Anyhow, before we start with its onslaught throughout Europe, we should take a minute to set the stage for what was going on in Europe in 1347 when it arrived. Europe at this point, we often refer to it because they refer to it as Latin Christendom, and represents, you can sort of imagine it essentially as modern Europe, the geography that it represents. So in Europe, after a period of decline, warfare, instability, and political fragmentation with the dissolution of the Roman Empire, by about 1250 or 1280, Europe, Christendom, had enjoyed really 4 centuries of steady growth. Starting around, let me get back to me, just because, starting around 1000, the year 1000 or so, more and more land came under cultivation. This is an important moment because what you see is a steady rise of agricultural productivity, population, and general wealth creation in this period. A lot of different reasons for this, but one of the most important seems to be something called the medieval climate anomaly, what they call the MCA, the medieval climate anomaly, which ushered in some warmer temperatures that were beneficial to agricultural productivity. And in this way, in this period between about 1000 and 1300, 900 and 1300, Europe emerged from a period of essential rough subsistence, right, subsistent level agricultural and wealth production, and developed into an active economy, developed a fairly sophisticated systems of trade. It's a period where you see the rise of cities, rise of universities, of arts, of culture, and this goes along with increasing political stability and centralization in France, in England, in Spain, in Germany. In Italy, somewhat, you do have the city-states that were still highly urbanized because the cities of the Roman world had never really died out in that earlier period of instability. But by the time we get to about 1250 or 1275, we sort of reach the high mark of medieval civilization. So this is the period, for instance, when we get the great cathedrals. I'm showing you here, Notre Dame. I'll go back to those maps. I missed those. This was being built in the first half and then up through the middle of the 13th century. Literacy jumps immensely in the period, so just some data points. Book production is going to grow 7-fold per head in Europe in the period between 1000 and 1300, and in absolute terms 12 fold in terms of book productions. Cities dotted the coastlines and enabled trading routes along into the interior, along rivers and roadways. Things started to take a turn for the worse around 1280 or so for a number of reasons. Partly these were environmental. They were largely political and economic. These things are, of course, all intertwined. The early 14th century saw a number of severe tensions. The most famous was a severe famine that hit all of Europe in 1314 to 1317, and it may have killed up to about 15% of the population. We see the beginning of the Hundred Years' War between England and France in 1337, which on the French countryside really caused massive damage and disruption to society. In Italy, on the Italian peninsula, you see a series of increasing political tensions between the city-states. So when plague arrived, it arrived into a society whose health and stability was not as strong as it had been a century earlier, and whose economic and social systems were somewhat on edge because of these variety of local factors. This is where we begin our story. So I want to go back actually to these two maps. So we have here the spread of the spread of the Black Death, and then here I have a map of the different trading zones, and you can see that the Black Sea over. Let me get the Black Sea over here is the link between the Central Asian trading route that's represented by 3 and 2, the larger Mediterranean trading zone. The link here is the city of Kaffa right here that we talked about before, which seems to be the link between both trade, but of course plague. So we might as well begin with the story that Gabriel de Mussis tells of the arrival of plague to Italy. I'll return to de Mussis on a number of occasions in these future presentations, because he touches on a lot of themes that we want to pick up later on. But for now, let's just follow his narrative. De Mussis is writing from his hometown, where he was a notary in the northern Italian city of Piacenza. It's located between Milan and Bologna. And he talks about how the plague arrived on a Genoese ship from Kaffa. This is the modern city of Theodosia, which is a resort town on the Black Sea. Kaffa was a Genevan shipping port, right? The Genoese were great sailors and tradesmen, and they, along with the Venetians, controlled much of the trade in the Mediterranean, which brought goods from the Silk Road into the European market. The Genoese had bought the city of Kaffa from the Golden Horde in 1348, allowing them to have the entrepot there in order to make that connection. So they settled in Kaffa. They owned the city of Kaffa, the Genoese did, from 1343 onwards, but they were then in turn, in 1345, beseeched by a Kipchak Khan named Janibeg. And in de Mussis' account, and this is the best evidence we have at this stage, the Mongol army, he calls them the Tartars, right? Same, referring to the Mongols, that were infected with the disease when they besieged Kaffa, and they brought the disease with them. Famously, de Mussis describes an early form of biological warfare, what we would call germ warfare. He says that the Mongol army would catapult their diseased dead into the city to infect the Genoese inside the city. This is on page 17. He said, and soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. And we're going to come back to this. I want you to remember this because the prevailing theory of how you got sick was from poisoned airs, the miasma theory. Dumussis talks about the poisoned air sort of idea of disseminating poison as a mechanism of the transition of the disease. According to Dumussis, the Genoese ship was then infected with sailors, and then those who were ready to go on the next ship sailed to Italy, bringing them their bringing the disease with them. Okay, so the ship would have gone down and come up through there, or the Messina. Historians don't actually think that the single Genoese galley was the singular vector of this transmission. Other accounts talk about 6 Genoese galleys arriving in Messina or a number of other scenarios. But in the larger sense, the story is correct in which overseas trade routes are precisely the mechanism whereby the plague, previously contained to the sparsely populated Asian landmass, were ignited and were then infected into the more highly concentrated and populous area in the Mediterranean. So from Kaffa, plague reached Constantinople in 1347, also on Genoese ships. Let's see, do we have a good map here? See Constantinople, it's not, okay, Constantinople there. It got to Cairo, keep it down here, further down there, and Messina in Italy, which would have been over here. From Messina on Sicily, it then marched upwards up the Italian peninsula to Pisa, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, Barcelona, and then, of course, it marched inland. It got to Florence in April of 1348. I want you to remember that because you're going to be talking about Boccaccio later, who was a keen observer of that moment. In the words of one historian, the plague then, quote, moved like a well-drilled army forth from its maritime bases into the hinterland. It's documented in what they call the Empire, in what we would call Germany, and France and Spain by 1348, and Vienna by 1349. It arrived on the coast of England in 1348 and then infected London shortly after that. So by this point, you imagine people knew that it was coming. Travelers, who were not themselves infected, of course, brought stories and warnings in advance. And in future presentations, we'll talk about some of the things that people did, cities did, to try to protect themselves or ward off the arrival of the plague. And we, of course, will discuss the actual disease next time. But let's just take a minute to note what Dumussis, right, in the moment actually says about it. He describes the onset of plague repeatedly as being struck by darts or arrows. It's a phrase that he uses frequently and a lot of writers do. And I want you to keep this in your mind as you do the reading. It's the sort of overwhelming metaphor for plague. Dumussis describes the rapidity and horror. Let's get back. The rapidity and horror of the progress of the disease. He says as it attacks both men and women, it begins with chills and stiffness, and then a hard, solid boil shows up in either the armpit, under the armpit, or in the groin. Patients, he says, fall to fever and get stinging headaches. They vomit. They'll vomit blood. They're hugely, there's a huge stench that comes from them. Some, he says, die the day they get it, but most will die within 3 to 5 days. Rarely, he says, but sometimes if the fever breaks, some might recover. And what he is clearly describing here is bubonic plague. Dumussis is horrified by the rapidity and its morbidity. He discusses the sheer number of people who were simply taken away. So he says that in Genoa, only 1 of 7 people lived. In Venice, he claims that 70% of the population was decimated. He speaks with horror about how people returned to their towns and, quote, a single person would come to town and would speedily poison his whole family, and within 3 days the afflicted family would succumb to the death by the dart. Here's another example. The ensuing mortality was so great that people could scarcely snatch a breath. The living made preparations for their burial, and because there was not enough room for individual graves, pits had to be dug in colonnades and piazzas where nobody had ever been buried before, and it often happened that a man and wife, a father and son, a mother and daughter, and soon the whole household and many neighbors were buried together in one place. The towns had to conduct mass funerals, but there wasn't enough room to bury the dead. There weren't enough priests. This is all Demusis, right? He says there weren't enough priests to administer the last rites, and you can imagine this must have been offered grave anxiety at a moment, because this was the solace in the face of final judgment. And then even those priests who came to minister began to die. Priests and doctors, this is on page 19, priests and doctors, upon whom most of the care of the sick devolved, had their hands full in visiting the sick, and alas, by the time they left, they too had been infected, and they followed the dead immediately to the grave. You see this notion actually in quite a few accounts, that both the priests and the doctors that were ministering to the sick themselves then died. And what you're getting here is just one voice of massive social disorder and dislocation. I'm taking these examples from Demusis, which is probably the most famous account, but you can find dozens of chroniclers describing these same events. And we have chronicle evidence of this sort for the onset of plague in the late 1340s, from Syria to Norway, from the Mongol world, from the Arab world, and obviously from all over Christendom. Mostly we see the response demographically. That is to say, a 15% decimation of the population is what, of course, makes this a world historical event. But it is also worth noting for a minute, or just dwelling on the fact that this would have had a multitude of personal dimensions. So I'm just showing you, this is just one example, a diary from a Florentine merchant named degli Ablisi, who recorded one after one the inexorable death of each member of his family over the course of 1348. Everyone who survived would have lost immeasurably. So the chroniclers describe various forms of civil response to social chaos. One of the things that a lot of people noted is that it hit the rich as well as the poor, and a number of really high-ranking people succumbed to plague. Kings and queens, Eleanor of Aragon, who was the queen of the King of Aragon, the King of Castile, Alfonso VI, the daughter of the King of England. You see a lot of bishops and cardinals die. It was indiscriminate in a way that was surprising. The plague occasioned massive social unrest, unsurprisingly. In Europe in particular, we're going to look at some of the offshoots of that social unrest and the preventative measures that were then taken to try to stop plague. The first wave of the pandemic seems to have died off by about 1350 or so, but it would return initially in a cycle of either 11 or 12 years, and then stretching out to 12 or 13 or maybe even 15 years. The plague returned in 1357 and then again in 69 and onwards. As it returned, resilience seems to have been gained. So as it returned, some resilience seems to have been gained. When in the first instance, plague carried away people that were in prime of life, which was itself a problem because that left orphans, right, children, and the elderly in times that survived with no one to care for them. It increasingly targeted children, which is its own cruelty. Grave numbers, for instance, in Florence, indicates that the plague visitations of 1400 and 1423, it was 65% and 69% children who had died. Plagues continued to hit, but in some places it became known as children's plague. And it's just worth noting that the arrival and recurrence of plague would be a feature of European life until the middle of the 17th century. So, on that grim note, next up is the disease itself, which will hopefully be a bit shorter. I wanted to keep these to about 20 minutes or less. But for the moment, be well and be safe.